Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brandon Cole. Opposition groups in Syria said up to 400 bodies had been found in the town of Daraya. The Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has said the government needs more time to win the battle against rebel forces. It all comes as the French President François Hollande has urged Syria's opposition to form a provisional government, which Paris would recognise. Meanwhile, the UN's new envoy to Syria, Lakhdar Brahimi, has made his first public appearance at the United Nations since he took up the job. That was abandoned by Kofi Annan earlier this month. Annan's 6-point peace plan failed, so will the new envoy do any better? Can there be unity among Syria's fragmented opposition? And even if there's no unanimity at the United Nations, can there be an agreement to some kind of intervention in future? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Karl Sharro. He's a Middle East commentator for Al-Akhbar English. Dr Alan Mendoza here in the studio, founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. On the line from Moscow is Vicheslav Matuzov. He's a former Russian diplomat and chairman of the Russian Friendship Society with Arab countries. On the phone from Cairo is Dr Omar Ashour, director at the Middle East Studies Institute at the University of Exeter. I'll start with the comments by François Hollande. Karl Sharro, it's controversial stuff, isn't it? Is Mr Hollande here trying to take the lead?
I think we've seen a precedent of this in the past in the case of Libya when Sarkozy sort of led the Western action for intervention. But we need to understand what the reasons for that is. I think as the situation in Syria kind of goes on for longer and longer and it's lacking this clarity or clear way for the West to approach it, there's sort of signs of discontent. And it's been read before in the past that there's an inevitable or lack that intervention is sort of not necessarily inevitable. But I've always said there's a certain unpredictability to the Western position on Syria because it's not defined clearly by a clear sense of interest in the region. So it seems to be a bit erratic. Hollande's statements are actually a manifestation of that in my reading. There's a sort of public pressure that something needs to be done about Syria. And in a sense, Hollande is the first to crack under that pressure and kind of move it a notch up and start a kind of this process of meddling in Syrian affairs, but not necessarily informed of a clear plan of action and a clear set of expected outcomes. And that doesn't necessarily mean that other Western nations will be drawn into that process. But I think it will continue this sort of process of preventing Syrians from shaping the result of the outcomes.
Alan Mendoza, Hollande doesn't have the support necessarily of London or Washington. Do you think Hollande is right to trying to seize the initiative?
Well, he's certainly trying to seize the initiative. It's also a very French thing to do if you see this historically. I mean, we've seen the Libya case already, but there have been previous precedents back in 1995 over the final intervention in Bosnia, for example. Jacques Chirac absolutely led the way on that. By staking the position out there, Hollande is, in a sense, challenging and daring the other Western leaders, or indeed other leaders full stop, to come and join him. My position is here. This is the right thing to do. There is a national interest from the point of view of France, Britain and others, contrary to what Karl said. It's to stop human life being lost. And I think that is what Hollande has been motivated by.
Vyacheslav Matuzov, Russia has always argued strongly that there needs to be a unified opposition. So they'll be supporting actually what Hollande says, won't they?
Mr. Hollande declared a separate step, a separate policy that differs quite a lot from agreed stance that were worked out in Security Council resolution that supported Kofi Annan's mission, and against all principles agreed in Geneva, where conference agreed on the principles of common action. And any separate states weaken the common approach to solving the Syrian crisis. And we are about now two directions. If we work separately from France, United States, Russia, China, Iran, and so on, or we are make joint efforts to solve Syrian crisis. I think that Mr. Hollande suggested us a separate steps that differ and contradict the resolutions of Security Council, the decisions of Geneva Conference. I think it is way to deadlock, to the deadlock that don't solve the crisis. On the contrary, it is increasing tension, increasing bloodshed, and increasing military confrontation in Syria. I think it is not a true right way that we are following.
Dr Omar Ashour, in Cairo, where you are, key to the Arab Spring movement, where in Egypt was a viable opposition, the Syrian National Council is saying that the opposition is making serious preparations for a transitional government. Do you see this as imminent, or is this too far-fetched?
There is some serious divisions within the ranks, but I think it's a very positive step. I think it will be supported by states including France, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and even here in Egypt. Military action on the ground does not have a united leadership, and the political action abroad does not have also a united leadership. And if we can solve this leadership crisis within the pro-change, pro-revolution forces, that will be a critical step forward, and it will limit the damage. I think Bashar's regime in Syria will collapse sooner or later. What happened afterwards is what is really critical, because when we have this kind of divisive leadership, no plan for the post-Bashar Syria, we may see a situation that turns down into some kind of a civil war.
Karl Sharro, Hillary Clinton snubbed the Syrian National Council during her recent visit to Turkey. Do you think the group is on the verge of irrelevance, as one Western diplomat has said?
I've actually maintained that for a long time, because I think there's a genuine disconnect between the individuals within the SNC and the SNC as an organization and the real momentum of the Syrian revolution, which I believe to be a valid movement for democracy, valid, legitimate and aspiration movement for democracy and freedom. And that disconnect is not a technical issue like it's discussed now. You notice many people, when they're looking at the issue, and Omar did say that, in a way that makes it appear as if, well, let's just put these people on a table and tell them to kind of get together, and there's actually structural reasons that preventing them from becoming this legitimate political leadership. And I think Clinton's snub in a way illustrated that. And the other thing that she did is she insisted on meeting with the activists who are present on the ground in Syria, sort of pointing the way towards where the real legitimacy is. To my mind, that's where the real kind of the formation of the local coordination committees, the people that are involved with the Free Syrian Army, that potentially will yield into some sort of political formation, have more legitimacy and better understanding of what sort of transition Syria needs. Counterproductively, any attempt by Western leaders to associate with them will actually take away their credibility and legitimacy. So I think that should be handled with a lot of care.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. We're discussing Syria and its future. With me is Karl Sharro, Middle East commentator and columnist at Al-Akhbar English, Dr Alan Mendoza, founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. On the line is Vicheslav Matuzov, a former Russian diplomat and chairman of the Russian Friendship Society with Arab countries, and Dr Omar Ashour, director at the Middle East Studies Institute at the University of Exeter. Alan Mendoza, the Arab League is trying to encourage opposition factions to sign up to a common transition plan. The Syrian National Council is reluctant to do that, isn't it, because it fears losing power? Is that right?
Well, I think it's lost power already. I think it's become quite clear that the emperor has no clothes in this regard, and that if the opposition get together in a more broad-based approach, it's going to be the only way you're going to see some traction on that side happening. The SNC can't claim to speak for everyone. We know it doesn't already. And if it doesn't take part in this new initiative, it really will be condemned to irrelevance, because others, I'm sure, will fill the vacuum.
Karl Sharro, you wrote last week about the effect of defections from the Syrian regime, or in fact, the lack of effect that they have. How key are they to a downfall of the Syrian regime, and can we trust the reports of the defections?
Well, obviously, since I wrote that article, it turned out all the rumors about Farouk al-Shara defecting were not actually true. But there was something curious about this momentum that was starting to build up in the type of defections that we were seeing, because they were very dissimilar to what happened in other situations, Libya, for example, in a sense that they didn't have this momentum at the high level, but at the same time, we didn't see any structural defections within army units. So they appeared to, I called them at the time, voluntary abductions. There seems to be a lot of effort that goes into convincing high-ranking individuals to defect, but they don't have any expected position to play within the opposition. So there's no clear political role. They seem to be sort of more like symbolic gestures. And that to me epitomized the fact that they are not actually born out of conviction of the need for this shift in position. But also, they kind of hinted at the possibility that there's a new formation now happening with Syria, that sort of leaders within the Sunni community are sensing that any coming political compromise or political solution might happen along what we call the Lebanese model, in a sort of consensus between different confessional groups that will lead to a political solution, and they probably were expecting to play a role within that. Interestingly, the leader of the SNC, Abdul Basit Saida, came out very clearly to say there is no role for people like former Prime Minister Riyad Hijab and Munaf Tlass in the future transition, in a bid to sort of preempt their role and protect this multi-confessional, multi-ethnic nature of the SNC. So there's all this dynamic playing at the time, but it's all contributing to further fragmentation within the political opposition rather than a building momentum towards change and a proposed political solution.
Omar Ashour in Cairo, in Egypt, I guess the key to that was people from the previous regime are in the current government. How important are these defections? Are they more symbolic? Do they have any kind of impact in galvanizing support against the regime?
I think they are. They are quite important, and I think we saw major brigades leading the struggle in Syria, including Maher al-Assad. But the bulk of the soldiers were more or less, well, many of them were Sunnis. In the camps, if we saw many of those defecting, we will see something different on the ground. And the problem is that the defection has taken so long before it happened. But it is happening. The bulk of the Free Army and the other armed formation in August 2012 is very different from January 2012 in terms of the size, the scope, the quality of the officers. And I think this will keep on going, but the problem is that it's not tilting the balance of power quite significantly.
Indeed, and I'll turn to Vicheslav Matuzov. A month after rebel forces tried to capture Aleppo, Syria's second city, it appears that the momentum is starting to wilt. Do you think rebels overreached by taking the fight to Aleppo there?
Well, on the ground, we are now watching the situation in Syria, and we can conclude that Syrian rebels are not rebels from Syria. It is a sent from other countries, mainly from Turkey. Weapon is coming from through Lebanon territory, and it is very difficult to predict Syrian regime fall, because on the ground we now notice that Syrian army is laid down all those who came to Syria from abroad. And we had from our press, Russian press, some Russian rebels from Chechnya now are killed in Al-Halab, in Aleppo, and are buried in some territories nearby Chechnya territory in Georgia. So, predict the ground that Syrian regime should be fallen by all those who came and by military means. It is false conclusions. I think that all rumors about defection of army officers, about defection of Farouk Shara and killed Russian general, it is an informational war against Syrian government. I think that it's better to concentrate attention on the ways how to find solution. And the basic political basis for these steps are well known. It is Security Council agreed decision, consensus, American or European, Russian, that is concentrated on Kofi Annan's 6 principles. And now we have a new mediator in Syria. He is very experienced diplomat who can play a very important role to finding, but any other steps outside the agreed framework.
I just want to follow up on this point with Alan Mendoza. Vicheslav says there that he doesn't see all of the regime imminent with the recapture of Bab el-Amma district in Homs. We've seen how heavy weapons and how Assad is prepared to use heavy weapons. He's not going to relent, is he?
No, of course not. It's life and death for him. He knows his regime is under serious threat, and over time it will fall. Or no government can maintain a situation where it is not in control of its sovereign territory for month after month after month.
But are we going to see it be drawn into some kind of quagmire? Is that the rebels' best hope?
It's already in a quagmire. The rebels' tactics before they started, kind of attacking Aleppo, other places, was indeed to get the quagmire effect, and it was working quite well for them in terms of drawing the army, demoralising the Syrian army into things, forcing, by the way, Bashar to keep on using using more and more of his heavy weapons, aircraft, artillery, whatever it was, to come forward. What he's going to do, though, is going to play into the demands for intervention to save human lives. Because what Vicheslav has not mentioned, of course, he hasn't mentioned at all, is that tens of thousands of people are dying in Syria, and that is not an acceptable situation for the international community to sit back and say, let's negotiate around a table. It's not going to happen.
Karl Sharro, are the rebels winning the hearts and minds, though? Because a lot of Aleppans, they may not, for instance, stomach the regime, but they may not be liking the rebels' tactics either. If that's the case, is that important?
I think it's definitely important. I mean, the most important aspect in all of this is, in order to tip people over to the side of the revolution, there needs to be a very convincing vision for the future of Syria, and also a way of conducting this revolution in a way that people that can buy into it. Now, part of that is the usual conduct of war, and particularly in guerrilla war situations where you might support the revolution, but if they come and start fighting next to your house, you'll be discontent. So we've seen a lot of discontent in Aleppo itself. So I think the strategy itself was that the rebels were in Aleppo, they bit far more than they can chew in that specific occasion, and it kind of backfired slightly. When the battle was more in the countryside and in rural areas, they had sort of achieved high levels of efficiency, but that doesn't in itself carry a momentum towards tipping the balance. Now, the point in all of this discussion, I think what it points to is the likelihood of a military victory for either side, which, by the way, the regime is intent on now, because it has clearly stopped all its political initiatives. So previously to this, it had proposed certain reforms that were completely kind of ludicrous. It tried to run with the elections that proved not to have any response. And now it's very clear that the regime is intent on pursuing a military solution. But I don't see a military victory for either side. So the only solution can come from some form of political settlement that reassures people that are not with the revolution now that they have a place in the future Syria, and reassures, for example, the Alawi community in Syria that their continuing existence within the country isn't dependent on controlling power and having Bashar al-Assad in power. That's what the rebels and the political opposition need to focus on. Once they achieve that, the situation will start to tip politically in their favor.
Omar Ashour in Cairo, we have a new envoy to Syria. Is he going to make any difference?
I think it's bigger than a change of character in the envoy, especially that the current envoy had some roles earlier in Algeria, for example. In 1992, he joined the so-called State Council, which is an unconstitutional formation that happened after the coup in Algeria. So the rationale goes that if you cannot bring democracy or you cannot help democratization in your own country, you can bring it to others. And his record in Afghanistan in the elections was not that high, but and the situation, I think it's much more complex than sending or changing the name of the envoy. I think what really matters in Syria right now is the situation on the ground. There has been some advances. There are multiple politicians here from Egypt who went to visit the situation in Syria and from the Turkish borders, and went so far as Aleppo with checkpoints that was mainly manned by Free Syrian Army personnel. So there is a change on the ground, but again, it's not that significant. And I think without tilting this balance of power, any political talks will not be that significant.
Mohamed Morsi, Egypt's newly elected president, is meeting in Beijing this week to discuss Syria. Do we see that this is a change of heart from China, and that they would be contemplating some kind of action or intervention in Syria then?
I think it's an attempt. There's no secret that the new government here in Egypt is very much pro-Syrian revolution. They know quite well that the key positions of Iran, Russia, and China, if it changed, then probably the change in Syria will be expedited. And what he's trying to do is to attempt to change the position of China, which they probably estimated as the easiest to change on the Syrian situation. And I think there will be also the visit of Iran, which is upcoming next. There will be as well an attempt to address the Iranian position over Syria. The question is what will be the cost for changing the position of both countries.
Alan Mendoza, Morsi is also due in Iran. Is this a significant sign of rapprochement between the two countries, a kind of step between building Sunni Shia differences over Damascus? What do you think?
Well, it's over many things, but the very fact that you've had an Egyptian leader visit Iran for the first time in over 30 years is quite significant, I would suggest, in terms of where this is leading. I think it's part of the changing power balance in the Middle East. Egypt is seeking a new role for itself, obviously, following its own revolution. We should, of course, point out the Iranians are intervening in Syria right now. We know that the Revolutionary Guard are there. Iranian generals have said so already. So there is this tension between Egypt and Iran over the situation in Syria. But I suspect what President Morsi is actually doing in Iran is just assessing the situation, going along to a conference, seeing what he can pick up in terms of diplomatic support, and perhaps trying in the margins there to forge the situation. But he's not going to change Iran's mind. Iran is absolutely wedded in lockstep with the Assad regime. It's their one reliable ally in the region. You will not see a change there from the point of view of Iran.
And I guess we're possibly not going to see any difference in differences at the United Nations. Now, the Henry Jackson Society, on your website, you do explicitly state that there is a legal case for intervention. In what circumstances would that be applicable?
Well, it comes under the responsibility to protect. When you have civilian massacres occurring over and over again, the responsibility to protect, the UN role itself, allows for intervention in this regard. It's quite clear that, with the stakes being upped, with Assad using increasingly, sort of heavy weaponry in his mission, with the decline in interest in a political solution to military, you are seeing a campaign against the Syrian people. The Assad regime do not care who they kill to get their way. And at that point, the balance starts to shift internationally. It will become very interesting at the UN and what happens to China and Russia's position as it becomes increasingly obvious that he's out to kill people.
Karl Sharro, I mean, what central to this is Russia and China's position, or is it? There could be a situation where actually they could be circumvented, couldn't they?
I don't think so. I think everyone who's talking about this and kind of proposing different ways of convincing China and Russia in particular don't understand that this is not just about Syria for them. China and Russia are fighting a long-term trend that they've seen get out of hand of breaking the United Nations as an organization that was designed and based on sovereign nations, and kind of legitimizing further and further external acts of intervention that will tend in the future to put control over their own territory in danger, but also destabilize and kind of threaten their strategic interest across the world. So Russia's and China's position needs to be understood from that. Meanwhile, on the other hand, we have the Western nation that's sort of gone into this cycle of miscalculated interventions, I think, in a lot of instances, somehow legitimized around the principle of right to protect and humanitarian intervention, but in many instances creating more kind of complex and, in instances, disastrous effects, but also kind of intervening in the political formations and maturity of sovereign nations. So we end up with lots of nations created that are unsustainable entities that will require lots of continuous overseeing by the West to make them viable. And that's definitely not the situation that we want to see in a country like Syria, which is so crucial and pivotal in the Middle East. And that's why, in a sense, you see the Western reluctance. I mean, we talked about Hollande, but the Americans and Brits certainly don't have an appetite for military intervention right now, having just left Iraq, which actually backfired completely that adventure. So I think a bit of humility and understanding of this historic role that intervention has played should point out the role that it's not actually so black and white. We don't just go in and solve it. We should allow these people to take control of their own destiny by themselves.
We're discussing the future of Syria. With me is Karl Sharro and Alan Mendoza, and on the line is Vicheslav Matuzov and Dr Omar Ashour. Omar Ashour in Cairo. It's obviously a completely different narrative being played out in Syria than was played out in Egypt. What do we make of the, say, for instance, the statements overnight from Bashar al-Assad that he's going to continue fighting, and also last week Barack Obama warning Syria that military intervention could be justified if the government used unconventional weapons? What kind of diplomatic stalemate do we have here?
It is a stalemate in many ways. I think the key issue here, that the new government has a lot of pressure on it from the many of the Syria's supporters here in Egypt, who would like to see a tougher diplomacy and even many kind of aid, including the training and the military aid done here by the new government. If you see every demonstration since the Syrian revolution started in Tahrir had the flag of Syria. and had the chance of Syrians and had Syrians speaking in Tahrir Square. So there's this kind of public pressure that affects the diplomacy, since the government now is accountable and there is elections every 4 years. They had to change their foreign policy and become more aggressive towards the situation in Syria. But again, they cannot influence the situation on the ground that much. Because of this, we have this stalemate, because of the lack of this power to change the conditions on the ground. And I think there is no secret. I mean, there is no love lost between the president here, President Morsi, and his party, the Freedom and Justice Party, and their movement, the Muslim Brothers movement, on the one hand, and the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria on the other.
Alan Mendoza, your point is really clear that there needs to be some kind of intervention, perhaps a kind of intervention along the lines of Bosnia or Iraq. But there's kind of an intervention at the moment, isn't there? I mean, there's rebels are being armed. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, arming rebels.
Of course, interventions happening all over the place right now. By the way, you shouldn't conflate Bosnia and Iraq. The two are very different interventions. One is an air campaign, one is an on-the-ground campaign. Nobody is proposing an on-the-ground campaign in Syria at all. Nobody would do that. But looking at the other areas, look, you've had various forms. So you have the supply of arms there. And this is an interesting point to what Karl said earlier, stating that allow the people to take charge of their own destiny. Well, that's all very well, Karl, but I'm afraid at the moment, one side's got heavy weaponry to massacre the other side doesn't, and so it's very difficult for the lesser side to actually win a military battle in those terms. I think what you're seeing is an attempt to solve this without a formal intervention. The next step presumably will be some kind of buffer zone where safe areas, we've all heard of safe areas before.
But Assad has ruled those out. Assad has ruled that out.
It'll be against his will. That's essentially how that'll happen. It'll be a coalition. If the UN won't do it, a coalition of states will, led over the Turkish border. They will create buffer zones, and at that point the game is really up for Bashar, because when you lose your territory, much like Saddam Hussein in the 1990s, the only way is down from there.
Yeah, I think this is quite a delusion to imagine that you can have a no-fly zone and some sort of aerial campaign without having to get involved on the ground. I mean, even if you remember the situation of Iraq post the Gulf War, there was a no-fly zone, and there's sort of a kind of remote management of the situation in Iraq under the sanctions, and then that potentially led to a renewed intervention. What you will see in Syria, if that scenario starts to emerge, and I'm not ruling it out, I think Western countries in specific might find themselves in a situation where they would accelerate the implementation of the so-called humanitarian corridor under protection of aerial cover and with some sort of aerial bombardment campaign, is they will get sucked into the conflict in Syria very quickly afterwards. There is no way, seeing how the dynamics of the conflict militarily are being played out, and especially in places like Aleppo and Damascus, that you won't have to intervene and put boots on the ground. In principle, it's wrong because it will shift the dynamics in unpredictable ways, but also it will be this kind of unintended consequences. They will be sucked into a conflict whose dynamics they're not really, the Western countries, not really understanding, not really knowing what precise outcomes they need out of it. It's just under this kind of very vague moral principle that we all appreciate, but there's a political reality on the ground that doesn't stand up to that. So I think we really, really be careful of that. And if I can just give one example, actually, of an instance of that happened in neighboring Lebanon, where in the early 80s, Britain and France and the US sent their troops in there under the international force. And that ended in a very disastrous way for very similar reasons, because there was no clear reason for why we're there, and they didn't understand what their immediate and long-term targets would be.
I'd just like to finish by thanking all my guests: Karl Sharro, Middle East commentator and columnist at Al-Akhbar English, Dr Alan Mendoza, founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. In Moscow, Vicheslav Matuzov, a former Russian diplomat and chairman of the Russian Friendship Society with Arab countries, and Dr Omar Ashour in Cairo, Director of Middle East Studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter.